Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin, and here's my co-host, Kong, from Kong vs. Godzilla, or Godzilla vs. Kong, I guess. No, I'm just kidding. But we do have Dr. Jeannie, I'm going to not say your name right, probably, but Constantinou, right? Constantinou?
Almost. Constantinou.
Constantinou. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, who wrote a wonderful book called Thinking Orthodox. And that book is, frankly, it blew my mind. I read it. It was the first book I read after I finished catechumenate, and it was super awesome. It's one of the best books for understanding the Orthodox faith. And one of the things that I think this book is so helpful for is that it really does present the Orthodox phronema, or mindset, like the Bible talks about having the mindset of Christ. Well, basically, this book shows us what that means and how we can cultivate that. And it's just super helpful for so many reasons. And I think, whether you're Orthodox or not, you can get a lot out of this book. If you have any desire to know anything about how Orthodox people think, because let's face it, we think totally differently, you should definitely read this book. So, and also today, because we have Dr. Jeannie on, I want to make sure that everybody knows right off the bat that if you're watching live, you can feel free to put your question in our little question box, and I will make sure that Dr. Jeannie sees your question so that she can answer it for you. And feel free to ask about anything, but we're going to try to keep it as much on topic as possible. So maybe don't ask her about Godzilla, although I always love Godzilla conversations. But yeah, you can ask me about Godzilla later. I have an article about it, but that's cool. So Dr. Jeannie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of who you are and how you came to write this wonderful book?
Well, I live in San Diego. I'm married. I'm an Orthodox Christian for my whole life. I teach biblical studies and early Christianity at the University of San Diego, also at the Franciscan School of Theology, which shares a campus with them. That's a graduate school of theology. And also at a Coptic School of Theology. So I'm a professor, basically. And I wrote the book because...
So you are like the ecumenical professor. You're like your ecumenicism personified there.
I don't know about that, because I'm not... I mean, it depends upon what people think of as ecumenical. A lot of times people think of ecumenical as where you're just sort of, sharing the faith or compromising the faith. Everybody's got, different idea about what it is. But I'm just an Orthodox Christian who teaches the Bible, teaches early church, and they've kept me around, all this time. They're at the university, especially on the university level, they're looking for people from different faith perspectives. I mean, we have Muslim scholars, Jewish, Buddhists, you name it. There's, Protestants, Catholics. I was the first Orthodox person they hired. Sorry. But I mean, don't think that just because it's a Catholic school that everybody's very, very Catholic. I'm more Catholic in some ways than they are, because they're extremely liberal in their ideas, So I've been there at, with the Franciscans. I'm sure they would be happy to hire Catholic biblical scholars. But I was there, and they asked me to do it. But also, especially for the Franciscans, there's a certain sort of spirituality in the Franciscan tradition that is very compatible with Orthodoxy. And I think that might be one of the reasons why they asked me to teach. I wouldn't work as well, let's say, in a Jesuit environment.
Right.
But that's a different kind of a thing. Because the Catholics have speaking of phronema, Catholics have lots of different ways of thinking, of theologizing, of spirituality, because they have embraced a big plurality of this.
Right.
So the Franciscan is more incarnational. So that's more compatible with Orthodoxy, but still, as Roman Catholics, they have ideas that are very different than ours, and they are not familiar with the early church in a lot of basic things. So for me growing up, because I also had my undergraduate degree from this university, from the University of San Diego, I would go to my classes, my theology classes, they called it religious studies. And there were a lot of things that professors said that sort of were a little bit off. They were kind of in the ballpark. It was like if you're looking through a lens or something and it's kind of fuzzy and you need to adjust it to make it something that's clear and that you recognizable. Something's off. And I never understood why. So it took me a long time to figure out what it is, why there was something not quite right about what my Catholic professors were saying. I'm saying, setting aside anything that's obviously heretical, because that would happen too. Okay. So what I came to realize is that those of us who are in the Orthodox Church, have or should have an Orthodox mind. And the word for that, or attitude, the word for that is phronima. So this really crystallized for me a while ago. And I began to start talking about it on my podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. And people started saying, how do you get an Orthodox phronima? So I began to realize that it's a very important topic, but there wasn't a single book on the subject. I don't know if there is in Greek or Russian. There might be, but maybe not, because it's about how you think, how you perceive the world, how you negotiate the world, your presumptions, all the things that are never expressed. And I knew that that was important, but I wasn't sure how to talk about how you think. And so I knew I had to sort of approach it from a basic perspective, talk about the same old for us, which is tradition, the fathers, and scripture, but to try to explain it in a way that people could grasp. And also that would be something that might be useful for non-Orthodox, because I would have conversations with people and they think they understand us because we use the same terminology. We might talk about sin, for example, or salvation or confession. And what we think about it, how we go about it, what we understand about it is nothing like Western Christianity. Now, Catholics might say, well, we have that too. Yeah, they have that along with 1,000 other things.
Right.
But for us, that's everything. You see what I mean? So the Catholics tended to be very, not exactly dismissive, but did not comprehend how vastly different our minds were. They just think of us as Catholics who don't have the Pope, pretty much. Eastern Catholics without the Pope. And it's so much deeper than that. And I just thought that the book would be helpful to people. And the other reason was because of all the internet discussions going on where people think that they're qualified to give theological opinions. And I find that extremely dangerous. And I think that that's another big problem that we're having today. As people are learning about Orthodoxy in the English-speaking world, they're turning to the internet and they're encountering a lot of extremism, or sometimes the opposite. And so I really felt that needed to be addressed too. I'm not sure the two things belong in the same book. And I told them that in Ancient Faith, I said, I don't know if this belongs together at all, but nobody took it out. So I said, okay, well, I guess. So people have different opinions. Some of them get to that last part and say, wait a minute, why is this here? And other people say, yeah, this is what, we need. So I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, because it has to do with your attitude. You see, phronima is all about attitude, mentality. And if you are on the internet arguing about, toll houses or something like that, or the vaccine, you don't have an Orthodox phronima. If you think you can read a few books and tell other people how to live their life, you don't have an Orthodox phronima. So I think that this is very important. But why? They wouldn't accept that. because anytime I try to engage people to say, you really, I couldn't say you don't know what you're talking about, but I would try to gently say, listen, that's not quite right. And here's why. They would just, slam me. They'd throw some patristic quotation at me that's taken out of context. Or they, would say, well, I'm relying on the fathers. And they're very proud of themselves. There's such arrogance.
Right.
And, I just thought that somebody had to say what's wrong with that mentality, because they think they can hide behind the fathers, and they can hide behind a very famous Orthodox maxim. And what is that, Kevin?
I don't know. Tell me.
It is, what did the true theologian is
one who prays.
Praise, right. So they would say, I would say, listen, if you're going to talk about theology, you have to know something. You have to go to school, you have to study, you have to. No. The true theologian is the one who prays. Okay, so that means, are they saying that they're such a prayerful person, such a saintly person, that they can discuss these deep mysteries? You see what I'm trying to say? Unfortunately, right. That's true for the Orthodox, because theology is not a matter of human reasoning. That's why we say it has to do with prayer. But that doesn't mean that any Joe Schmo should get on the internet and, regardless of their passion, regardless of their commitment, regardless of how much they think they know, it's a very, very dangerous thing, personally dangerous, for a person to present themselves as somebody who has theological knowledge, because the true theologian is one who prays, not the one who's on the internet, arguing over certain issues. You know what I'm trying to say? So they're quoting that as a response, or as an excuse for ignorance. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. So the fathers were not ignorant. The fathers were not uneducated.
Right.
They were people. If you want to talk about the fathers, you have to really know them, and you have to start by imitating them, which means years and years of education, a deep spiritual life, a deep life of prayer, many years of involvement in the church, not somebody who's just, come around or just started reading a few books. Like, I understand how that is, because I was very enthusiastic when I was younger, very enthusiastic about orthodoxy, talking about things, love to talk about theology. But as I've matured in my life, I understand how dangerous this is and how inappropriate it is.
Right.
And you need to spend years listening and learning and reading and engaging in the worship of the church. This is how we develop that kind of deep understanding that is really and a pastoral sort of approach that is truly what the church is all about.
Right.
So when people spend their time arguing on the internet, that's not Orthodox. That's not what we do. You throw your patristic quotation at me, I'll throw my patristic quotation at you. That's very Western Christian. That's not who we are. That's not how we handle things. Okay, so that's a long answer to your question.
No, but I think it makes sense, and the internet is not, at least like chat boards and things are not really the place to discuss theology, because the problem is, like, actually, ironically, a priest who I know posted to Facebook, which I thought was kind of funny, but he said that Facebook is not the place to discuss theology because it sort of constitutes casting your pearls before swine in a way, because you're just throwing out these truths and
That's
in
why
a situation where they're not. I mean, you think about it, like in the very early days of the church, people couldn't even partake of the Eucharist until they were baptized.
Well, they still can't, right?
Well, right, but I mean,
they couldn't even witness it.
Right, that's what I meant.
Know the creed. Yes, I know what you meant. So they didn't even know the creed. So because this is one of the things I talk about in that last part of the book, which is about theologizing. The truths of the faith were something that could not be really understood by people, and the church guarded them like precious pearls.
Right.
And like they said, they weren't cast before swine. So there was a presumption that you cannot understand the faith without accepting Christ, without being part of the liturgical worshiping community. So they would never have been debating, on the internet. But here we are, and we're saying everything, and people are discussing the most sublime mysteries, and they think that this is a subject for conversation. And they're treating it like a philosophical debate, the procession of the Holy Spirit, these kinds of things. This is not a discussion to have on the internet. These are discussions that might be appropriate in a school of theology, but it's blasphemous. It really is, to treat these subjects as though they were just a philosophical, table talk. That's what they're doing.
Right.
So it cheapens it, and it cheapens the faith, and it's inappropriate, and it's spiritually dangerous.
Right. Now, I do have some gratitude for people who, because like I don't know how much of my show you've seen or things, but I actually used to be part of a cult, and there were some people who did witness to me online, and if it weren't for them, I probably never would have come out of the cult.
Okay.
So I definitely am grateful to people who have had the ability to articulate things on the internet. So I don't want to say like, oh, all internet conversations are bad, but I think that we have to do it within the right mindset and not just be throwing things out there as if
right. But I'm sure they were talking about deep matters of theology. You see what I'm trying to say? You're absolutely right. The internet is both a blessing and a curse. It is a way right now that we're able to communicate. So the question is again about propriety. So we don't discuss things that are inappropriate, but to reach out to somebody and say what you believe is wrong, and here's why, in a polite and respectful manner, and engage them in a conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. So some people have become a little confused by my book because they said, what does this mean? We can't talk about it. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying know the time, the place, and have the right attitude. Because anytime you talk about God, you are theologizing, right?
Right.
But we just want to be careful how we do it, because we have to recognize we're talking to a human being, and we don't always know what state of mind they're in. And we don't always know as much as we think we know. So we have to do it with humility, with the right attitude. But no, I don't know your story. What cult did you belong to?
So I was actually part of a group, Seventh-day Adventism.
Okay.
Well, my journey was a little weird because I was actually raised Roman Catholic, and then I ended up swimming in some different streams. So for a time I was converting to Judaism, and then while I was in the process, I'd spent about 5 years in the process of, because in Judaism they're not really supposed to embrace converts. You're supposed to kind of rebuff people, and so I was very into it, but I also was trying to do anyway. So then I ended up.
May I ask you a question? What attracted you to Judaism?
What attracted me to Judaism was, well, I had never been properly catechized. So I went to Catholic school, but the particular priest that I had was unfortunately not. I don't think he had really been trained how to answer kind of weird questions that I had. Like, I'd ask him things like, well, why doesn't the Bible talk about dinosaurs? And he's going, oh, don't worry about that. The Bible's just a poem. Don't think about that. And I'm going, don't think about it. The Bible's just a poem. I don't have to take it seriously. Well, then what the heck? What about these moral questions I'm dealing with? Should I just not take the Bible seriously there either? Is it just a poem? So I had these deep wrestlings, and I felt like, with Judaism, I think a couple things attracted me to it. One was a fascination with the state of Israel and the Holocaust in the 1930s and 40s. And that gave me this sort of fascination with Jewish survivability, so to speak. And then just this and then I got kind of into this really militant sort of mindset of like, Israel is the people of God. These horrible Muslims are this scourge of the earth, and Israel will save the earth from these horrible people. And just this really bizarre sort of, I mean, it's weird because, like I said, in Judaism, I don't know how much of this American Judaism would even really recognize, but yet I sort of had this very evangelical end times speculative sort of thing, but with a Jewish veneer. So I was in a messianic thing for a while, and I was planning to go all the way and become Jewish, but somebody challenged me with the fact that nobody actually said this to me. It just it was sort of a Pascal's wager thing that got to me, because I realized that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. But all of the Jewish rabbis I was reading would say something more along the lines of, if you're about 60 to 70% a good person, you'll go to heaven no matter what you worship. You could worship a rock and heaven. Yeah, most of them. There's no sort of there's no exclusivity in the Jewish religion. Anybody can go to heaven. You don't have to be Jewish to go to heaven. So what I realized was, at least on an intellectual level, I realized that, okay, if I follow Jesus and it turns out that the Jews are correct, I can still go to heaven according to the rabbis. If I follow the rabbis and it turns out Jesus was telling the truth, I am totally screwed. So it sort of scared me straight a little bit, but I was still really into like the Jewish stuff. So I picked Adventism, and then Adventism, it is not truly like a Christian thing. It's not like Protestantism, where you've got Christianity with some additions like sola scriptura. It's very much its own sort of religion. But it had a community that really attracted me, because I was just in a dark place in my life. Being this militant person, I had always wanted to join the military, and then I did football and got really big. And when I got really big, I had an asthma attack, and so the military wouldn't take me. And that was like my whole identity was the military, and now I couldn't do it. I think if I tried to join the military today, they would probably take me, just because like I haven't really had any problems with asthma in a long time, and I'm pretty athletic, but just that one asthma attack was enough at that time that it was like, nope.
Is that why you identify with Godzilla?
Probably. Because he's like the ultimate.
He's a bad boy, and he's good, right?
So, but I think in some ways, I think what attracted me to Judaism and what attracted me to Orthodoxy, there could be a link there, because I think part of it is the idea of tradition.
Yes.
The idea of, one thing I notice about sort of Western Christianity, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you're much more knowledgeable than me, but within Western Christianity, what I see a lot of times is, and whether you're Seventh-day Adventist, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, there's this sort of mentality that, like, if we just examine the primary sources, whatever we deem them to be. You know, in Protestantism, that's just the Bible. In Adventism, you have the Bible plus a latter-day prophet.
Yeah.
In Catholicism, you have the Bible and anything, I guess, all these papal statements,
Yeah, right.
and all this. But if we get to these primary sources and we just sort of examine them and what they say, then we will come to all sort of true discernment.
Right.
But within Orthodoxy, we have an understanding that I actually think, in some ways, I think Reformed Christians have started to pick this up in a weird way, because I know they're very different from us, but I hear them talk about a lot of the same thing of like, no, you won't. An atheist could read the Bible and could know what is written on the pages, but he doesn't know the Bible because his mindset, his worldview,
Right.
is totally off. And so I think that sort of, we intuitively kind of get that, but we don't really apply it to ourselves and say, okay, but is my worldview off? What should I be thinking?
Yes.
And what attracted me to Orthodoxy was this idea of tradition, and how tradition kind of, at the time I didn't necessarily know the idea of the phronema, but the idea of tradition was like, okay, so if one person said that tradition was like preserving the worldview of the apostles. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. Like the worldview that gave us the Bible, that kind of should be how I see the Bible, is through that lens.
Yes.
And so maybe speak to that. Like, how does the Orthodox phronema inform us when it comes to things like that? When it comes to how do we kind of see tradition? How do we deal with all of these things?
Yes.
In a little bit different way than, because the West has a lot of these concepts, but I think that they're different.
Oh, they are different. So I think what you mentioned was so powerful. And you're right about tradition being sort of the mindset of the apostles. So how are we different, and why are we different? And also what you mentioned, that's not just what you read in the Bible. There are Bible scholars who are atheists, by the way, and New Testament scholars who are Jewish, and of course, Old Testament scholars who are Christians. So there's quite a mix of people who believe that you can just look at the text and understand what it means. But that's never been the case, not only for the New Testament, but for the Old Testament as well. And who said that before we ever did? St. Paul. Remember where St. Paul talks about how when the Jews read the scriptures, it's as though there's a veil in front of them and they cannot understand them. Now think about St. Paul going to synagogue after synagogue after synagogue and arguing with the people in the synagogue, trying to prove to them from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. And that's what all the apostles did, right?
Right.
Jesus is the Christ from the scriptures. They could not accept it. They're reading the same Bible, but they're not interpreting it the same way. And so finally in Romans, St. Paul talks about how they have a veil in front of their eyes. And until they accept Christ, then the veil, they can't understand it. When they do, the veil is lifted, and all of a sudden they understand what they're reading in an entirely different light. So Orthodoxy has preserved that understanding. So what we have done is that we have kept that mind of the early church. And that's why phronema is so important. And that's why, even though you're right, there are a lot of Protestants who are thinking about these things, mainly because they have recently started reading the fathers. They're beginning to appreciate the patristic mindset, and reading and translating the fathers. That's a kind of a new thing in the Protestant world.
Right.
But they don't understand the fathers either, because they don't have the phronema of the early church, and they're treating the fathers the way they treat the Bible. They will lift quotations out of the Bible, out of the fathers, and try to use them to prove, atonement, the theories of atonement or predestination or whatever. They don't have the mind of the church. The mind of the church is not by taking isolated statements from the Bible or from the fathers and creating whatever ideas that seem right to you and using proof texts. That's not what we are. What we have is the mind of the church as it has been faithfully preserved, unchanged. And only orthodoxy has done that. And until you accept the fact that we have it, and the others who they're trying to recapture it, they can't do it. You can't do it outside of orthodoxy.
Right.
Because you don't have everything that supports that worldview. This is what Catholics do. They take little bits of this and that. They have icons. They'll hear about the Jesus prayer, so they try to incorporate that. They try to take a little bit of the fathers, a little bit of this, and a little bit of that. Like, they're going through the smorgasbord, at a buffet and trying to take a little bit and create something that's not who we are, and it doesn't work. Because orthodoxy is an integrated, cohesive whole. All of the elements fit together, and there's no disruption. The iconography reflects the theology, and that doesn't change. The hymnology expresses the theology of the church, and that doesn't change. We don't care how brilliant you are, how smart you think you are, you have some new idea about Jesus or the Trinity or anything else. We don't care. If it wasn't taught by the early church, we're not interested. Okay? So what we have everything that was given to the apostles, the faith of the apostles, and we're just keeping it unchanged. Now, it's not exactly true to say that we've never changed. Obviously, in terms of liturgical developments and some traditions which are more culturally based, we've added those in. But the core of the church, what we believe, how we live, is part of our phronima, our lifestyle is absolutely integral to what we believe and how we behave and how we worship. So you can't just take one aspect of it and think that you're somehow going to understand the early church.
Right.
Why are the apostles so important? Because they were taught by the Lord.
Exactly.
Okay, so when people say, well, this is the traditions of men and the traditions, no. What Jesus was criticizing the Pharisees for, that was traditions of men. But what the apostles taught came from the Lord. That's not traditions of men. That's from the Lord. That's teachings from God. And so that's why we hold on to it. We're not just mindlessly following some tradition because it's quaint or it's, we just like it for its own sake. It's because it's true, because Jesus taught the truth. And we have to acknowledge that Jesus was with the apostles 3 years. How many things did they hear from him that weren't written in the Bible? How many things after the resurrection? How many things after the resurrection? Lord, what about this? What about that? What about that? That's not in the Bible.
Right.
So we relied on the apostles to teach that. When they went to a new city, they didn't leave a book. They didn't leave a manual.
Right.
They taught people. They taught them not just what to believe, but how to live and what kind of attitude they should have toward their fellow human beings. And so the mind of the early church was vastly different from the 21st century mind in the Western world. And if you can't understand that, you can't understand the New Testament. So people are trying very hard with the word studies and with the research and with the archaeology, and to a certain extent that helps. But you can't understand Paul unless you understand him as an apostle of the early church. And people think just Judaism and Roman Empire. No, it's so much deeper, but I don't even have the words to express it because it's intangible.
Right.
It's intangible. And it's not written down anywhere. And people say, where's the earliest place that talks about this? Well, guess what? They didn't write things down.
Right.
They didn't. First of all, because the faith was a secret. Okay. A mystery. Secondly, because people didn't commit everything to writing. So this whole thing is that we have to prove that the early church did fasting, or we have to prove that the early church baptized infants. I don't care. You know what? I know what's true. I don't have to justify what you prove that what you're saying is true. Don't make me try to prove, because what we have is the continuous tradition of the church, unchanged from the time of the apostles. I know that infants were baptized, so I don't care what anybody says. You prove to me that they were not baptized.
Right, exactly.
What I'm standing on is strong, a very strong foundation. It's the apostolic foundation. It's set down by the Lord. So
that's right.
This is just, but it's very, very difficult to get that across to people who insist upon documented proof and the application of human reasoning for everything that's true. I don't know how you can talk about that when we have the cross. The cross contradicts all human reasoning.
Exactly.
Okay? It's just I don't know, but this is so deeply ingrained in people because we are enculturated in our Western culture to think always very logically, very scientifically, very historically. It's so deeply ingrained that people think there's no other way to think.
Right.
And that's what Orthodoxy offers, and Western Christianity doesn't have a clue about.
Right. And that was actually one of the most eye-opening things in your book for me, because I was always getting this question from people, especially, well-meaning Protestants who thought I was going down a bad way. The question I would always get was, well, where is it even written? Where did even the church fathers, where did they write this stuff that you're believing? And for a lot of it, I could actually provide some source. But for some of it, it's like, but your book just opened my eyes to see, like, well, yeah, but it's not like these people were writing everything down. That's such a 21st century mindset, as we have this sort of idol of like, oh, we have to write everything down for posterity. But they were from a completely different world where you might write things. I mean, even like a good example of this is I study a lot of philosophy, and Plato actually has a lengthy discussion, which again I always think is kind of funny, because he has this lengthy discussion in, I think it's in Republic, where Socrates is condemning writing, and Plato is recording Socrates condemning writing. And it's like, okay. But it's interesting because it shows how in the ancient world, like, even if you were going to write down what your teacher said so that it could be disseminated more, they still don't trust they still don't trust it as much, because they know what's going to happen. They know that somebody
is going to take that and distort it. Yep.
Exactly. That somebody's going to read this and say, oh, Socrates believed.
Yeah.
And they're going, no, Socrates did. Well, he said it right here. Yeah, he said that, but he didn't say what you're saying.
Yes.
and that was just so mind-blowing to me. It's like, okay, yeah, it is like this 21st century thing that we think the only way to educate people, the only way to disseminate information is to write it down and send that out, as if this, and I think we almost have this idea that that's better than an oral thing, because it's like you have the exact words forever. But ancient people didn't think like that. For ancient people, it wasn't necessarily even about the exact words. It was about the thought, the mindset that went into it. And you can't transmit that through writing. That has to be learned orally.
That's exactly right. That's beautiful. You're exactly right about that. Let me interrupt before you go on, because
go on.
St. Basil talked about lots of things that were practiced in the early church that weren't written down, or that were part of the ancient apostolic system, like facing east to pray, for example. It may be a minor thing, but it's something. Now, he also talked about how what is important is exactly what you said. It's not exactly necessarily the exact words, but how you understand things. Because when they were having the Arian controversy, Basil said somebody might accept the exact words of the Nicene Creed, but he still thinks incorrectly about what it means. So he didn't that person. On the other hand, a person who didn't like the wording, but still had the right mind understanding about who Christ was, he was okay. So we have to get beyond this idea of this kind of legalism that everything has to come down to the exact writing. And you're right. Not only did people not trust writing because you had to understand the whole concept or the whole mentality of the teacher, like Socrates, they didn't trust writing because you could change it very easily, because all books were hand copied. That's why Revelation, at the end of it, curses a person who would change it. Those kinds of curses were found in many early books because people did distort writings, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just through carelessness. But that was a fact. People didn't trust writing. You never knew who actually produced this copy, or whether even if you know the copyist, you don't know whether or not the manuscript he copied from was genuine. And so people didn't trust writing. They also learned by hearing. And that's even in the New Testament. We, come to Christ by hearing. We hear the gospel. We hear the gospel. We don't read the gospel. We hear the gospel. So people would go to school with a wax tablet, maybe if they were learning to write letters, but otherwise they sat and they listened. And they sat and sat and sat and sat, and they memorized and memorized and memorized.
Right.
They didn't write things down.
Exactly. And so much of education back then, even in the philosophy schools, so much of education was actually a lot more question and answer. And in some ways, the desert monks are actually a really good example of this, because that's how they still to this day educate one another, is just through this process of, like, your teacher actually asks you questions and then sort of critiques your answers in a way, like, well, this, no, that's not right. Or, yes, that's perfect. And then he gets to the next guy, and the next guy says the same thing because that guy said it was perfect. No, it's wrong when you say it. but see, that way the teacher has the ability to really share with you what his perspective is.
Exactly. To really fine tune it. Because if you think about it, even when something is in writing, which you brought out very beautifully, you can have something in writing and it's completely misunderstood. We've all had the situation with, look, you and I, just to set up this conversation, we're going back and forth. And And I said, look, just pick up the phone and call me, because I have no idea what it is that what you want. And it's kind of clear to you, and you think it's, and I'm like, I'm not quite sure if I understand. So, there's a lot of misunderstanding that can happen through the written word also. Or, like you said, you don't understand the totality of the context.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Which is why I think somebody like, that, to a certain extent, that's a testimony to some of these great authors like Fyodor Dostoevsky, who's able to write in such a way that I really feel like I'm there talking to these people. I feel like I'm getting the emotion and things. I really think Dostoevsky leaves very little room for misinterpretation, just because I know what he's trying to say. Although to that point, he chose to write novels, not
descriptive. It's descriptive, and that's different. But when you're talking about theology, it's very tricky, because so much of it, first of all, it has to be very precise. And our language for theology is Greek. And there are many words that simply do not lend themselves to a particular, or for the New Testament, for that matter, to one good English word. So you have that issue too. People ask me all the time, what's the best English translation? I said, well, you know what? What do you prefer? There are some that I would stay away from completely, but there's none that's perfect. They all have their shortcomings. They all have their flaws. They're and every single one, I'll say, well, I wouldn't have translated it like this. I haven't found one that I really think this is the best. Okay. Because I do use Revised Standard, that's sort of standard. But there are lots of times when I don't like that particular version because it's not really capturing what I think the Greek is trying to say. No translation is perfect. That's just how it is. So we have to consider that too, that the culture of the apostles is something which is behind the New Testament and part of the early church. And that is something that has really been preserved in Orthodoxy in a way that hasn't been preserved in the West, because the West changed dramatically during the Middle Ages. And there's an entirely different mindset that developed in the Catholic Church that then the Protestants came out of that, and they still have that mindset. They think they don't because they're everything Catholic, but they don't understand us because they're reacting constantly against Catholicism, but we're not Catholic. And we don't think like Catholics. And we, you have bishops, so what? You have tradition, yeah, but we don't have it the way the Catholics do. We have Sabbath, yeah, but not like the Catholics do. So they're clueless in that way because they can only see the world through the lens of Western European thought.
Right. It's true. And it's interesting too, because it's like they think that they're super anti-Catholic and that they're so totally different. And it's like, well, actually, you're a lot more like Catholics than you think you are.
They are. Yeah.
You have
the two sides of the same coin, and many people have said that. So they're just two sides of the same coin because they have fundamentally at their base, they're just arguing about, they're accepting certain premises, and then they're just arguing about what that means.
Right.
And we're not even part of playing that game. We're not even there, So.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my dad one time, and he is Roman Catholic, and he asked me, so why don't you, you're done with the Protestant stuff and all this, why don't you join like a Eastern Catholic thing? And I stopped for a second, and then I said, the truth is I can't do that because it feels really good that in Orthodoxy, I feel like I've stepped outside of the Catholic Protestant debates. It's like you guys have all these debates, and I feel like I've just sort of stepped outside of them and can look at these debates and say, yeah, I just don't see that. But if I become Eastern Catholic, then I basically have to step right back in there because the liturgy would be the same. And even a lot of the, to be fair to Eastern Catholics, they do use our theology as well to a great degree.
Yeah.
But the context, I think, is still basically, I mean, like I really love reading Thomas Aquinas, but, to be an Eastern Catholic, there would be sort of there's a famous YouTuber right now who's an Eastern Catholic, and he's a Thomist. And I'm going, how do you reconcile being a Thomist with the theology of the East?
Yeah.
I just don't get that.
Right.
I just don't get that.
The Eastern Catholics, there are so many different varieties, and then what you would get in a parish would depend very much on that particular priest, because some of them go to Roman Catholic seminaries and they're very Roman in their understanding, and then they just liturgize as Easterns. So it's really not anything comparable to what we have, because they don't always have our phronima either. How can they if they recognize the supremacy of the Pope?
Right.
How can we have our phronima? They don't have our polity. They don't have our church structure. They don't understand all the bishops as equally participating in the apostolic preservation of tradition, and not just the bishops, but the people. How important is it that we are held responsible as individuals for preserving the faith? That's so important. Right. That's why we're obsessed. That's why all the Orthodox go out in these campaigns. We're sort of trying to tell people, this is why this is fueled this internet thing. And I understand it, because we all feel responsible for preserving the faith. We don't look to a magisterium. We don't look to a pope. We don't have Orthodoxy. The early church was never centralized under one person.
Right.
The idea that the church is founded on a person, Saint Peter, is contrary to the scriptures, contrary to the early church tradition. I would never be able to accept that, ever. I'd rather,
Right.
like you said, step out of it completely than try to pretend that somehow Eastern Christianity under a Catholic, umbrella is the same as Orthodoxy, because it's not.
Right.
And they are also told, because for a long, there's an Eastern Catholic parish here. I mean, lovely people. I know that they're trying to, some of them have said to me, we have the best of both worlds. I would say you're in neither world. You're
Right.
neither Catholic nor Orthodox. You're in neither place. And this one parish, I went to the service there once, and I looked at their liturgy book, and it had the Filioque. All right. Now, I went at a later time, and they had removed it. Okay.
Oh,
They
okay.
changed it. So the Pope told them, I can't remember which one, I think it was John Paul, they don't have to affirm the Filioque. Okay,
Right.
now here's my question. The Filioque, for anybody who's listening, are the words "and the Spirit," that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and Catholics added "and the Son." Now, that's a dogma for the Catholic Church.
Right.
Okay? It's a distortion of the creed. It's an addition to the creed. It's a dogma. How, and so is, by the way, papal infallibility and all these other things. How can you say it's a dogma, but you don't have to believe it? Okay. How can, it is either correct or it is incorrect.
Right.
Which one is it? If for the Roman Catholics, for a Pope to say you don't have to affirm that, why? Why not? Does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Son also? If he does, tell them to say it. If it doesn't, why are you having the Roman Catholics say it? You see my point? So there's a lot of inconsistency. They're trying to, and this is their approach to us. They think that somehow we can reach some kind of an agreement that we'll just come under the Roman umbrella. We can still operate the way we always have. We just have to accept the Pope. It doesn't work like that. That shows how different their phronema is. We don't think that way. Orthodoxy is a cohesive, integrated whole. Exactly. Everything we believe, everything we do fits together perfectly. You can't take a piece out and say, you can keep doing everything you're doing, just recognize the Pope. No.
Right. Okay? Exactly. Because it's interesting.
We don't have our truth from the Pope.
That's right. Or from some magisterium that's headed by him.
Yeah.
Right.
And by the way, they're changing constantly.
Right.
And I don't know tomorrow what the Catholic Church is going to look like, because today it looks nothing like it looked like 50 years ago or
That's
500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And I don't know where they're going, but I know where we are, and I know where we're going, and we're not changing.
Yeah, that's what Father Josiah Trenum said about why he became Orthodox in the first place, was just this idea of, like, he was Presbyterian, I think, and he said that, what he realized was, man, the Presbyterian Church my father gave his life to is not the Presbyterian Church that I have.
Yes.
And if I give my life to this church, then what I give my life to won't be there for my kids or grandkids.
Yeah.
And then you look at Orthodoxy and you're going, the Orthodox Church has been the same for 2,000 years.
Right.
I can be confident that it's still going to be there when my great-grandchildren are around.
Sure.
I don't have to worry that I'm going to do all this for a church and then see it.
Yeah.
I mean, for Roman Catholics, like within my, even just within my lifetime, I can't even imagine, like my uncle, he, in his formative years, everything was in Latin.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden it's in English.
Yes.
And then, and then we moved out here, and now it's like, out here used to be super liberal, and then for a little while out here, it was like everything was going back to Latin and being really conservative.
Yeah.
And the Pope says no more Latin.
Yep.
So all of the churches around here except for I think there's 2 churches in Portland that still do Latin Mass, and their bishop says they can, at least until he dies, I guess.
Yep, that's right. Exactly. That's exactly right.
And then there's an SSPS, what is it? SSPX church down in Portland, which is really nice for my bookstore because SSPX people love to read, so we're always like, yeah, come on in. But yeah, I find that to be really fascinating because
Society of Pius. He's talking about the people who were really very devoted to the Latin Mass, Society of Pius.
Yes.
Pius X. That's the X is for
right. St. Pius X.
And oh my gosh, you're so right. The Catholic Church is I think really on the cusp because of Francis of a lot of continued big changes. But he's trying to be very careful how he does it. But one of the ways that he's undercutting the traditional Catholic perspective and way of life is by eliminating the Latin Mass. I think the Latin Mass was growing, and people loved it because it was more like what we have. That is, there was a tradition behind it. There was a deep spirituality behind it. And because it was growing, now he's trying to really suppress it. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But all the things you mentioned, what about the Anglican Communion? Oh my goodness, how much the Anglican Church has changed in the past just a few decades. So people really are looking for stability, and the church that is the Church of the Apostles, and that's us. We're the only ones left. And so that's why it is important. That's why the Orthodox are becoming, I think, a little bit too, in many cases, sometimes a little bit too strident, a little bit too, I don't want to say conservative, but emphasizing things that maybe they shouldn't. I think the Orthodox have to be careful that we don't become like fundamentalists, because Orthodoxy is not about that either. But they're seeing what's happening in these other churches, and they're sort of holding on with a white knuckle grip to try to make sure that we don't become like that. But we don't have to worry about that. We should relax and be Orthodox. We don't have to become super Orthodox where, all we do is look like we came out of the village and we're completely backwards. And all we do is, read the lives of monks and things like this. We don't have to be extremists to be Orthodox. And I think that that's a disservice. So while we preserve Orthodoxy, that doesn't mean that we are living as though we don't belong to this century.
Right.
You know what I mean? Okay, because we have to walk that. Just like the Lord said, and like St. Paul recognized that people are in the world, but they're not supposed to be like the world. But that doesn't mean that, I can't wear my hair like this or wear a normal clothes and, have a normal job and that kind of a thing. And just be sort of like a person from a little village and wearing a mandili, a handkerchief or something.
Speaking of which, I think one thing that the Orthodox phronema is really unique for, and it's something that I hear people talk a lot about in the West, but in the West, I usually hear this idea of redeeming the culture, but what they mean is really replacing the culture.
Yes.
At least when it comes to anything localized. So maybe a good example is, when I talk to, like, a church I used to belong to actually sends missionaries to, I won't say what country, but it's an Orthodox country. Yeah. And I always tease them that they're sending missionaries to convert Christians. Yeah. But it's true, they are. Yeah. And that's super awkward for me because I'm always thinking, like, why? But one thing that's interesting is when I talk to them, what they inevitably say when I if I'm in a more serious mood and not just teasing them, if I actually ask them, why are you sending missionaries to convert us? Yeah. What they usually will say kind of revolves around the idea of what we would call small t traditions, sort of the local traditions. Right. And they have this idea that, they'll say, we need to redeem their culture. We need to make them not superstitious anymore. Oh. But what it seems to me is that when they say redeem the culture, what they mean is replace the culture.
Mm-hmm.
What they mean is remove anything uniquely, for example, Russian about being Russian. Remove anything uniquely Polish about being Polish. So, but the Orthodox phronema is totally different with regards to redeeming the culture.
Right.
So what do you think are some of the benefits maybe of some of these? Because you talk about it in your book, and that was really good. But maybe if you could expand that a little bit to what are some of the benefits of this sort of local traditions, and how do they actually help preserve the Orthodox phronema?
That's a really good point. The reason, especially if you go to an Orthodox country, you're really, I can't imagine why, but I get it, because this is happening. Orthodoxy in a place like Russia, it has been there for over 1,000 years. Okay. So it's completely immersed in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means, or Greece, okay, or Serbia or Romania, the culture is inherently Orthodox in a lot of ways. This is something I understand why people don't understand it, because I didn't when I was younger either. Because people used to say to me, to be Greek is to be Orthodox. And I'm like, no, it's not. Okay. When I was younger, I used to say that all the time, which of course on the most rigid level, that's true. Because when I would say no, it's not, it was because people were emphasizing the Greekness of church a little bit more than the Orthodoxy. So I don't like that. We're not here because we're not a church to preserve the Greek culture or the Russian culture. We're a church because we're Orthodox Christians. But what they were saying, I didn't understand what they were saying. What they were saying is you can't separate Orthodoxy. You can't take the Orthodoxy out of the culture. You can't take the culture out of the Orthodoxy. For people who grew up in that culture, if you go to Greece, every village has a martyr. Every village has churches and shrines and monasteries where things really happened, where St. Paul walked, where people died for Christ, not just in the Roman centuries, but in recent times under communism, even in Greece, under the Turks. I mean, the soil is soaked with the blood of martyrs.
Right.
Orthodoxy is so ingrained in people's psyche, you can't escape that. So you have it's so odd in a place like Greece, which I'm sure is the same in Russia. People who we would consider very nominal Orthodox, they practically never go to church, but they'll be driving along. They'll stop suddenly, driving a car, stop at the side of the road, make the sign of the cross in front of a shrine or something like that, and then they'll go back to cursing or something. I'm not advocating that, but they perceive themselves as Orthodox because it's so deeply ingrained in who they are. So you just tell somebody, well, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. Well, why? The practices that they have are an organic expression of their faith. Okay, the practices that they have been there for 2,000 years in many cases, for 1,000 years. And this is how the church spoke to them, and how these things. So it's very difficult to articulate, but the things that they do on a daily basis is how they live their faith. They don't have to go knocking on a door and talk to somebody about Jesus or have a Bible study. They never approach the faith that way. First of all, because somebody just asked me recently, well, what about the fact the Orthodox aren't, evangelizing? I said, what would they do in a village, in my grandparents' village? They're going to go say, I want to talk to you about Jesus. They say, have you lost your mind? Okay. I mean, the whole thing we were talking about before is we have this 21st century mentality that assumes, it's so arrogant that we are going to go teach other people how to be Christians who St. Paul evangelized, okay? St. Paul planted the churches there, or St. Vladimir established the churches there. The arrogance of that, because they don't think that this is the reason why we're having trouble in Afghanistan, okay? Because we think that we can just take our mentality and apply it to that place and
Right.
change them. Okay, change everything because we know better. It's a very arrogant attitude, and,
It is.
you can tell your friends, I said so. Okay, I don't mind taking the heat for that. There's a tremendous arrogance because the same reason that they don't understand the New Testament when they read it, because they don't have the mind of the church, they're not going to understand the mind of the Orthodox.
Right.
In that country, they may convert a couple of people who are very nominal Christians who don't really know, okay? But it's very difficult because it's so deeply ingrained. So all of these little customs, little traditions, that's not a superstition. Now, listen, I'm the first to say there are a lot of superstitious Greeks. That's true. But superstition is part of cultures everywhere.
Right.
Okay? And that's not a tradition, is not a superstition. It's an organic expression of somebody's faith. The same, so to pray in front of the icons, or to light the candle in front of the icons, or to make the boiled wheat for somebody who died, is that absolutely essential? No, but it's an expression of my faith.
Right.
Okay? So it's more than, it's not a superstition, but they have no appreciation for that because they have such a narrow view that everything is about reading the Bible and accepting Jesus Christ, and there's nothing else. You know what? That's not how ancient people lived.
Exactly.
They saw Christ and they lived Christ at every moment. And guess what? They made the sign of the cross over their food, over their bed, over their bodies, over their cups. When they left the house, we know this from ancient writings of early Christians. They signed themselves. Where did that come from?
Right.
Okay. Did the apostles give them that? I don't know. Or was that an organic expression? How can you ask your friends, how can you argue with the cross? How can this be wrong? Is this a superstition?
Right.
It's prayer. Jesus died on the cross. Why can't you respect that?
Right.
I mean, really, you're going to argue with me about that? Oh, but what is it? It's Catholic.
Right.
So they have no perspective at all.
Exactly.
This is their perspective on Christ and the church and the Bible. But the whole thing is this.
Okay? Exactly.
They don't see the world around them. All they see is through a very narrow field of vision. So they're well-intentioned, but they're off the mark. Let them go to a Muslim country and evangelize if they really care about bringing Christ to where he has not been named. That's what St. Paul said.
Right.
Not to go to a Christian country, but go to where Christ is not known. Okay, if they're really brave, let them go to a Muslim country and die for Christ. Okay,
that's what I say. That is what I say.
Like, and you know what? A lot of Muslims need Christ and they want Christ. And there's a lot of secret believers. Go to Israel and preach about Jesus because there are a lot of people who are hungry for Christ. Okay, so
that's right.
You know, anyhow,
absolutely.
Are there any questions? Let's turn to questions for the last few minutes because I'm going to have to go. It's
sure. So I actually only have one more question really, and that is, I think it's impossible today to talk about orthodoxy without talking about the idea of enchantment. Because so much of, like, Jonathan Peugeot, so much of the orthodoxy that's been exposed to people has this mindset of enchantment. So how can we help people, to maybe people who don't have an Orthodox phronema, how can we share with them the beauty of our phronema, the beauty of sort of our enchantment, and where that comes from? How can we at least express that beauty to help get the...
You don't mean magic or anything. I don't know. I'm not familiar with people talking about Orthodox enchantment.
Okay, so that's interesting. So enchantment, not necessarily, it's not talking about magic. It's more about
they went into service and experienced something.
Yeah. So, well, one good example is, like, I was just doing a thing refuting a prominent Lutheran theologian who was expressing why he didn't become Orthodox. And one of the things he said was that Orthodoxy was like a beautiful dream that he woke up from, was basically what he said. He thought about converting. It was like a beautiful dream, and then he woke up. And my response to him was, no, the problem is that you thought that it was just a dream, but what you were really seeing is that the human life was meant to be a song.
Yeah.
And when you were attending the Orthodox Church, you got to sing along with it. You got to sing along with the song, and then you decided that that song wasn't real and just left it behind.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, how could we have maybe helped him to see?
Yeah, I don't know that there is. I think it's very, very difficult. I sort of get what you're saying. A lot of people have come to Orthodoxy simply on the beauty of the divine liturgy and the churches. And I think that that's very important. I think that as Orthodox Christians, we should make every effort to have our worship services be reverent and beautiful, and our churches. I think that's very important because it's an expression of the kingdom of God. So to the extent that we have subpar choir, or our churches are not clean, or the service is not beautiful, I think that's a disservice to God, because we're supposed to offer our best. So it is important, but I don't know how we can help people see that. Many people have stepped foot inside the church, and they have completely different reactions. One of my friends is, I don't think this is a secret, so I'll go ahead and share what he said. This is John Maddox, who established Ancient Faith Radio. Because his daughter was dating an Orthodox Christian. They were like super Protestant, evangelical Protestants. And she was dating this Orthodox Christian. He got all concerned about it and decided to visit an Orthodox church. And the whole family went. And he was completely turned off by it. And they were very silent on the drive home. And his wife said, I feel like I've worshiped for the very first time. And he was shocked. That was not his reaction at all. That was not his initial reaction. The only thing I would suggest, because a lot of people have said this, who've had this experience, because I grew up in the church, so I haven't had this experience, is to go to the church every Sunday for at least a month. Because sometimes that initial reaction is of the sense of strangeness about it,
right,
is off-putting to Protestants. And also that anybody who's coming to the church, if anybody comes to a parish and they looks like they're a visitor, if could be a couple of people who can stand with them in church and explain to them what they're seeing, I think that would be very helpful. Because if you come there and you feel awkward and uncomfortable and you have no idea what you're experiencing, that's not good. So to the extent that a parish could be welcoming, but not just welcome them for coffee afterwards, but to stand next to them and say, if you have any questions, ask me, or whisper over to them every once in a while. This is called the entrance, and the priest is bringing the gospel out because he's about to explain it. And so he's holding it in procession because we respect the word of God. These are the words of Jesus Christ, who is the word. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
To the extent that the parish can have people like that ready to step in and welcome someone and give them some understanding of what they're seeing, that could be useful. But in terms of logically explaining or having them a tract, I don't know that that's as effective.
Fair enough.
It's nice to walk out with something in writing, but there's no perfect answer to your question. But the church should be beautiful. The worship services should be beautiful. And we should welcome people, and we should have someone there to help them understand what they're seeing if they're coming, and encourage them to come back and say, I know this is very strange to you. This is how the early church worshiped. Why don't you come back for a couple of Sundays, and maybe you'll feel more comfortable, because we have to remember that the evil one is also trying to keep them away.
Right.
So I've heard many stories like this, where they came into the church and the evil one was telling them, Go, run, flee. You shouldn't be here. Go away, go away. Why are you here? This is idolatry. So as they're standing in church, they're fighting these thoughts. This is really true because he doesn't want them to be saved. So we have to be there welcoming and informing them and just sort of a presence to stand next to them so they don't feel alone. Okay?
Right.
So there are ways to handle that. But in terms of our beauty, I think our beauty expresses what the church is. So we have that, but also, while we have the external beauty of the services and the beauty and the depth of our theology, we should also recognize we have our own issues, we have our own problems, we have our own little conflicts, we have our little squabbles, but that doesn't detract from the truth of what orthodoxy is.
Amen. Do you have time for one audience question?
Sure.
All right. So this is from Mikhail over in Toronto, Canada. He asks, "This is fascinating and I agree with what's being said. Yeah. What do you guys think is a good way to try and bring orthodoxy into the North American conscience?"
As you go out in your, thanks for the question, Mikhail. As you go out into your daily life, don't hide your orthodoxy. I'm not saying that you go out there and talk about the church all the time. That can be off-putting, but make the sign of the cross in front of people. Say, well, I'm sorry, I can't go because, or I'm not eating meat today. It's Friday, so we don't eat meat. So that opens up a conversation because a lot of people still have never heard of the Orthodox faith. Or, well, I'd like to come, but that's Holy Week for us. I'm an Orthodox Christian. So being very matter of fact about your faith and at least exposing people to this idea that this is something different. And also that the way we think is nothing like either Catholicism or Protestantism, to let them understand that there's another branch of the Christian faith that is the direct continuation of the early church. We can back that up. We're not like Protestants trying to find the early church or recreate the early church. We're the direct continuation, and that there are hundreds of millions of us. We're not some little offshoot sect. So to the extent that you can sort of expose that to people, let them know that we exist, people are coming to Orthodoxy slowly in the Western world, but a lot of them still haven't heard about it. So I would encourage you to do that in a very non-confrontational, sort of informative way. When I was teaching at the university, I didn't really, I don't like to talk about myself. I don't think professors should talk about themselves, but I would talk about orthodoxy. I introduce that to students so that they know that there's something else. I don't talk about myself as an Orthodox Christian unless somebody asks me. But for example, we talk about the Bible. We talked about the canon. This is what Protestants have. This is what Catholics have. This is what Orthodox Christians have. And who are the Orthodox? So I would explain it so at least they know about it. And in my explanations of the Bible, my orthodoxy comes out and it's obvious to Orthodox Christians who are in the room. Or I might mention something, but mostly because it's an academic class, I don't have the occasion to talk about Orthodoxy. It's the Bible anyhow. But I do let them know that there is this thing and what makes it, who are the Protestants, who are the Catholics, and who are the Orthodox. So whatever we can do to let people know that there's this wonderful treasure there that is a deep well of spiritual nourishment that exists, that is so different from the head games that people are playing in the Protestant world, or the arguments about the direction of the church that's happening in the Catholic world. For Protestants, everything is about the argumentation. It's all up here. It's all intellectual, but for us, it's in here, and it's deep, and it's nourishing. It's satisfying, and you don't have to try to explain everything all the time. You don't have to try to make sense of everything. You just drink it in. So.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Jeannie. I really appreciate you being here and encourage everybody to check out her book, Thinking Orthodox.
Orthodox, yes.
Super awesome book on having the Orthodox phronema. And thank you, Mikhail, for your question. Everybody have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.